Why would a woman who came to Silver Creek just to cook promise a dying cowboy she could save the ranch his own son was already preparing to lose? Thomas Callahan's boots hammered the baseboard as fever shook him on the floor. Snow hissed through the open door. Clara Whitmore dropped her bag, knelt beside him, and pressed a steady hand to his shoulder. "Don't worry about your ranch. I'll take care of everything." From the hallway, Elliot heard her and froze. What did Clara see that he didn't? "Tell me where you're watching from." The front door struck the wall so hard the iron latch bounced. Snow swept into the hallway behind Clara Whitmore, whitening the dark floorboards before she could shoulder the door closed. Her carpetbag slipped from her numb fingers. Then she heard the boots. Thump, thump, thump. An older man lay crumpled against the baseboard, his gray shirt soaked through with sweat despite the cold. His whole body shook. One boot kept striking the wall as fever worked through him. Clara dropped to her knees. "Mr. Callahan?" His eyes opened, but they did not settle on her. "Cattle," he whispered. She touched his forehead and pulled her hand away. "You've got more immediate trouble than cattle." Getting Thomas Callahan to the bedroom took nearly everything she had. He was a broad, heavy man even after illness had hollowed his cheeks. Clara dragged a quilt beneath his shoulders, braced her boots against the floor, and moved him a few feet at a time until she could get him onto the bed. Only then did she look around the house she had crossed half-frozen Montana country to reach. 3 weeks earlier, Thomas Callahan's advertisement had reached her folded inside a newspaper. Cook wanted at Silver Creek Ranch. Room, wages, honest work. Come before winter closes road. 12 words that mattered. The freight wagon had carried Clara as far as the county road before the driver refused another mile in the storm. She had walked the rest with one bag, 25 years of stubbornness, and her mother's worn cookbook wrapped in oilcloth beneath 2 spare dresses. Now the man who had hired her might not live through her first night. Clara fed split pine into the kitchen stove and searched the pantry. Beans, potatoes beginning to soften, a handful of dried herbs, old flour, and cattle bones. She held one beneath the window light. There was still marrow inside. By the time the water began trembling in the iron pot, hoofbeats sounded outside. The back door opened. A tall cowboy entered carrying snow on his shoulders and anger already in his face. He stopped at the kitchen doorway. "Who are you?" "Clara Whitmore." His eyes moved from her to the pot, then toward the hallway. "Where's my father?" "In bed." He crossed the room instantly. Clara followed. Thomas was still breathing. The cowboy stood beside him, and for one brief second the anger disappeared. What replaced it was worse. Fear. "My name's Elliot Callahan," he said without looking at her. "I figured the Callahan part. He needs a physician." "Yes. I sent for Henderson yesterday." "And where is he?" Elliot glanced toward the window. Snow pressed against the glass. Clara returned to the kitchen. He followed. "You didn't answer me." "I believe I did." "You're a cook." Clara set a cattle bone on the chopping block and brought the cleaver down. Crack. Elliot flinched. "Your father hired me to cook. The physician isn't here. Your father hasn't eaten. So until you bring me someone better, I'm what he's got." For several seconds, neither moved. Then Elliot looked into the pot. Those bones were going out. Clara added them to the stock. Not anymore. Near midnight, Thomas woke enough to swallow 4 spoonfuls. He frowned weakly. "What's in it?" "Bones, herbs, water, and thyme." Something almost like a smile touched his face. "Sounds like ranching." A weak laugh escaped him. Clara heard movement in the hallway. Elliot stood beyond the bedroom door. He had heard it too. Later, she found him sitting at the kitchen table with cold coffee between his hands. "Your father will look for your face tomorrow," she said. Elliot stared into the cup. "What am I supposed to do? Smile while this place falls apart?" "I'm not asking you to lie." "Good." I'm asking you not to make a sick man carry your fear along with his own." His jaw tightened. Clara expected an argument. None came. Before dawn, Thomas became restless again. "North pasture," he muttered. "Feed's running low. Elliot doesn't know about the note at Billings." "Duke," he tried to rise. Clara caught his shoulder and eased him back. "No. My ranch. Don't worry about your ranch." Thomas stared at her, suddenly lucid. Clara held his gaze. "I'll take care of everything." Silence filled the room. From the way came the faint creak of a floorboard. Elliot was standing there. He looked at Clara as if she had just promised to hold back winter with her bare hands. Maybe she had. An hour later, with Thomas finally sleeping, Clara entered the kitchen. Elliot stood by the window in the blue-gray light before sunrise. A folded letter was open in his hand. He turned when he heard her. For just an instant, Clara saw a man's name written across the paper. Harlan Duke. Elliot folded the letter quickly and pushed it deep into his coat. Clara said nothing. Neither did he. Outside, snow covered Silver Creek from the barn roof to the distant foothills. Inside, the broth simmered, and between Clara Whitmore and Elliot Callahan stood a letter neither of them was ready to discuss. For the next several days, Silver Creek seemed to shrink to the size of its kitchen. Thomas's fever eased slowly. 4 spoonfuls became half a bowl. Half a bowl became supper. Clara boiled beans with onion and herbs, mashed potatoes with saved drippings, and tested the old flour Elliot had already decided was spoiled. He watched her pinch it between her fingers and smell it. "You can tell it's good from that?" "You can tell most things if you stop deciding what they are before you've looked." The next morning, the smell of fresh bread traveled down the hallway. Elliot stopped in the doorway. For days he had eaten standing up or carried his plate toward the barn. This time he stepped inside and sat at the kitchen table. Clara noticed. She said nothing. After that, firewood began appearing beside the stove before she asked for it. Water buckets stayed full. When she needed potatoes from the root cellar, Elliot had already brought them. Their conversations remained short. Their silences did not. One afternoon, Elliot picked up the worn book Clara kept beside the flour bin. Its leather cover had softened almost to cloth. "My mother's," Clara said. He started to put it down. "You can look." The pages held recipes, but also cramped handwriting in the margins. What could replace eggs? How to stretch flour through a long winter? What herbs settled a stomach? How to make supper for 6 when the pantry could feed 4? "It's not really a cookbook anymore," Clara said. "What is it?" She ran one finger along her mother's handwriting. Her voice. Elliot looked toward the hallway. "My mother kept a ranch journal." Clara waited. Calves, weather, debts, water. Every fence post she thought father would forget. "You read it?" "Not since she died." Clara closed her book. "I carried this 2 years before I opened it." That surprised him. "I thought reading it meant admitting she wasn't coming back." Clara looked down at the worn cover. Turns out she'd left words for years she knew she'd never see. Elliot did not answer. But that evening, Clara saw him standing outside the room where Margaret Callahan's belongings had been stored. He didn't open the door. Not yet. Thomas improved enough to sit beside his bed and complain about being treated like an invalid. That was when Clara knew he was getting better. He told her Margaret had once kept Silver Creek moving from that kitchen. "When she died, I kept the cattle alive," he said. "Suppose I forgot a ranch needs more than cattle." A few days later, Clara discovered a narrow storage room behind the pantry. There was salt, sugar, preserved vegetables, spices. Then she lifted a dusty jar into the light. Apples. Elliot entered behind her and stopped. "My mother put those up." Clara wiped the glass carefully. He reached for the lid. She moved the jar away. Not yet. Why? Clara looked at him. It's waited this long. We'll know when it's time. That night, over warm bread, Elliot finally told her why he had left Silver Creek 7 years earlier. Thomas had told him since boyhood that the ranch would someday be his. Elliot had heard only a sentence being handed down. At 23, during their worst argument, he told his father Silver Creek would die with him. Worse, he said Margaret had spent her life building something nobody would remember. He rode for Denver the next morning. Clara's eyes stayed on him. And yet you're here. 4 words, nothing more. They hurt enough. The following afternoon, Thomas mentioned Harlan Duke. Clara stopped cutting potatoes. Duke had wanted Silver Creek for nearly 10 years. Low offers, quiet pressure, suppliers suddenly nervous, neighbors hearing that Thomas Callahan was always one winter from ruin. Clara remembered the folded letter. That evening she waited until Elliot came in from the barn. You wrote Duke. His face changed. Yes. Why? Before you came, Father was sick. The cattle were thin. Bills were stacking up. So you offered him Silver Creek? I asked whether his offer still stood. Clara set down the knife. Are you trying to save this ranch, Elliot? He looked away. Or are you trying to find the reason to leave again? His chair scraped backward. You don't know what this place cost me. Then decide whether it's a prison before you sell it as somebody else's home. He walked out into the cold. For 3 hours, Clara heard nothing but wind against the windows. Then the back door opened. Elliot removed his gloves, sat at the table, and pulled a sheet of paper toward him. He wrote slowly. When he finished, he turned it around. Harlan Duke, my previous inquiry is withdrawn. Silver Creek is not for sale. Elliot placed the pen down. What else needs doing? Clara looked at him for a long moment. Then she pointed toward a sack near the pantry. Shh. Beans need sorting. He almost smiled. Later he carried the letter to Thomas's room. Clara stayed in the kitchen. She heard voices, then silence, a long one. Then Thomas began to cry. When Elliot finally returned, he stood beside the stove without speaking. Clara waited. He asked if I'm staying. And? Elliot looked toward the room where his father rested. I reckon I am. For the first time, Clara let herself study the man rather than the trouble surrounding him. The next afternoon, 3 riders appeared beyond the ranch gate. Gus Heller dismounted first. He removed his hat before entering. Thomas needs to hear this. Elliot's expression tightened. Gus looked from him to Clara. Folks in Callahan County are being told Silver Creek is finished. Duke's man has been through town saying Thomas is dying, the bank's coming, and Elliot Callahan will be gone before spring. The kitchen became very still. Clara looked toward the jar of Margaret's apples, then toward Elliot. Harlan Duke wasn't waiting for Silver Creek to fail anymore. He had begun teaching everyone else to believe it already had. Gus Heller warmed both hands around Clara's coffee cup, while the other ranchers sat stiffly at the kitchen table. Duke doesn't need to take Silver Creek, Gus said. Not yet. He just needs folks believing it's already his. Thomas's mouth tightened. Gus continued. If suppliers stop extending credit and buyers quit calling, the rumor does the work. Clara looked around the kitchen. How many families need convincing? Elliot understood her expression before she spoke. No. 30 for supper. With what? Clara glanced toward the pantry. What's here? 3 days later, Silver Creek smelled of bread, onions, beef stock, and apples. Elliot climbed the old orchard trees for frozen fruit Clara believed could still be used. He brought down a basket and set it beside her. You were right. About? There's more here than I thought. Clara looked at him. Neither mentioned the ranch. Their hands brushed over the same apple. This time, Elliot didn't pull away immediately. "Clara?" She knew that tone. "Not now." His eyes held hers. "I haven't even said anything." "You were about to." A little smile touched his mouth. Clara's did not. "Your father's recovering. Duke is circling this place. You're still deciding what Silver Creek means to you. Don't mistake somebody standing beside you in a storm for somebody you're ready to love when the sky clears." The smile disappeared. Not from anger, from understanding. Thomas later asked why she cared so much about land belonging to people she'd known only weeks. Clara kept peeling potatoes. "My mother's family had land once. Another owner understood their debts better than they did. By the time they understood what he wanted, papers had already started moving." Thomas watched her. "My father became a surveyor partly because of it. Said a person ought to know exactly what stands beneath his own boots. That afternoon, a stranger rode through the gate. He called himself Carol and claimed to be looking for cattle." Clara distrusted him before his coffee cooled. His coat was too clean for a buyer who claimed he'd ridden hard from Billings. His horse cost more than most cattlemen would risk on winter roads. And he studied the barn roof, creek road, fencing, and outbuildings more carefully than he studied livestock. Then Thomas entered, not carried, not leaning on Elliot. Walking. Carol's eyes changed for half a second. That was enough. By Saturday evening, 30 neighbors crowded Silver Creek. Gus and Ruth Heller came first. The Gerardis brought chairs. Daniel Marsh, 74 and respected enough that men lowered their voices when he spoke, arrived in an old buffalo coat, polished smooth at the elbows. Some came hoping Thomas would recover. Others came to see whether Duke's rumors were true. Then Briggs arrived. Nobody had invited him directly, but someone had brought him along. Clara let him stay. Halfway through supper, the whisper began. The Billings Bank had called Silver Creek's debt. Transfer was only a matter of time. Briggs even called the gathering Thomas Callahan's Last Supper. Elliot heard it. Clara saw 7 years of old defeat return to his face. "Is it true?" "No. Payment isn't due yet." "You have that in writing?" He nodded. "Get it. Clara, get it." She wiped her hands on her apron and walked into the front room. Conversation thinned. "Mr. Briggs," he turned with a pleasant expression. "I understand you've brought news about our banknote." "Well, I wouldn't call it news exactly. You told these people the bank has called the debt." Briggs glanced around. "I may have heard something to that effect." Elliot returned, carrying a folded bank letter. Clara took it. "The payment remains under its existing terms. Mr. Callahan has written confirmation. Anyone wishing to read it may do so." Briggs's smile weakened. "Perhaps my information is outdated." Clara gave him a courteous nod. "These things happen." Then she returned to the kitchen. Only Elliot followed. Only Elliot saw her grip the edge of the work table because her hands had begun shaking. He said nothing. He simply stood beside her until they stopped. Then Clara served supper. Daniel Marsh tasted the stew. Another spoonful followed. He looked toward Thomas. "Lord Almighty, Thomas, where'd you find this woman?" Laughter rolled through the house. Something broke loose with it. Bread passed from hand to hand. The Gerardis mentioned a cattle buyer looking for spring stock. Daniel said he'd speak personally to the bank manager in Billings. Men who had arrived discussing foreclosure began discussing calving season. Clara went to the pantry. She returned carrying one jar. Elliot saw it and became still. Margaret's apples. Clara placed them before him. "Now." Thomas opened the jar. The smell reached him first. His eyes closed. Daniel Marsh recognized them after one bite. "Margaret's!" Nobody needed another word. People remembered harvest suppers, weddings, winters when neighbors shared feed. Years when Margaret Callahan had sent food down frozen roads because somebody else's pantry was empty. For a few minutes, Silver Creek wasn't acreage, cattle, debt, or water. It was memory. Clara stood near the kitchen doorway watching. Across the room, Elliot was watching her. Later, after the last wagon and lantern disappeared down the road, Briggs found Clara alone. "You did well tonight. Tell Duke what you saw." Briggs paused. "And what was that?" 30 people who came wondering and are leaving certain." Briggs put on his hat and left. Elliot entered the kitchen afterward. This time he did not stop in the doorway. He came all the way to Clara's side. "When this is over, I want to ask you something." Clara's breath slowed. "Ask me in spring." "You'll hear me?" She looked up at him. "In spring." He remained beside her. She let him. Far away in Denver, Harlan Duke read Briggs's report. Thomas Callahan was recovering. Elliot was staying. The neighbors were returning. And Clara Whitmore had accomplished in weeks what Duke had spent years trying to prevent. Silver Creek believed in itself again. Duke folded the report. Spring was too late. If he wanted Silver Creek, he would have to take it before spring arrived. The courier reached Silver Creek at 7 the next morning. His horse steamed in the cold. He carried no friendly news, only a stiff envelope bearing a Denver seal and paperwork from the bank in Billings. Elliot read it beside the stove, then read it again. 6 weeks. Thomas lowered his coffee cup. "What?" "They've accelerated the spring payment. 6 weeks from receipt." The kitchen went silent. Their cattle would not be ready for market. The Jarity connection could help in spring, but spring had just been taken away from them. Elliot stared through the window toward the barn. Clara recognized that look. "Don't," he turned. "Don't what?" "Leave before you've left." His jaw tightened. "You saw the letter." "I saw a piece of paper." "You know what 6 weeks means." "No. I know what somebody wants us to believe it means." Thomas looked at her. Clara took the notice from Elliot and read it again. "We verify everything." For 2 days they did. Letters went to Billings. Daniel Marsh sent his own inquiry. Elliot rode into Callahan County and returned after dark with mud frozen along his boots. And no answer that made the deadline less real. That night, Clara opened her mother's cookbook. She wasn't hungry. She wasn't looking for a recipe. Near a page stained with molasses, she found one of her mother's notes. "When obvious choices are gone, look for the ones everyone stopped seeing." Clara sat very still. 10 years. Why would Harlan Duke spend 10 years chasing a ranch he told everyone was worthless? Why whisper against Thomas instead of buying better land? And why become desperate immediately after 30 neighbors left Silver Creek believing in its future? The next morning she found Thomas studying cattle records. "Tell me about the creek." He looked up. "What about it? Does it ever run dry?" "No." "Freeze solid?" "Not completely." Elliot entered, carrying firewood. Clara turned toward him. "You said the northern water runs year-round." "It does. Who owns the rights?" Thomas frowned. "Silver Creek, old territorial rights. Margaret kept the records." Clara's pulse changed. "My father surveyed land." Elliot stared at her. "You can survey this?" "No." Her answer came immediately. "And anybody who says they can learn it from a cookbook is a fool. But I know enough to recognize a question that needs a qualified man." She looked at Thomas. "When was this property last assessed properly?" Thomas could not remember. There had been offers over the years, several connected to Duke. Now even Elliot went quiet. Through Henderson's family, Thomas located a certified surveyor willing to come once the roads allowed passage. The bank was formally notified that Silver Creek's property assessment and water rights were under review, and the accelerated demand was challenged. Then there was nothing to do but wait. February settled hard over the ranch. One afternoon, Elliot found Clara outside behind the kitchen, working beneath crude cold frames made from salvaged glass and boards. He crouched beside her. It's February. I'm aware. You're planting seeds. Yes. We may not own this ground in 6 weeks. Clara pressed another seed into the dark soil. Because if we don't lose it, spring still comes. Elliot looked at her. Something in his face gave way. I don't want you to leave. Her hand stopped. After Duke, after the bank, after Father doesn't need you anymore. He swallowed. I still don't want you to leave. Clara slowly pulled off one glove. You remember what I told you? Spring. Ask me when you're choosing me because you want me, Elliot. Not because I'm standing beside you while the world is falling apart. He nodded. This time he did not argue. The surveyor arrived 4 days later than expected. For 6 days he worked Silver Creek. Old boundary markers were uncovered beneath snow. Creek measurements were taken. Margaret's records were compared against territorial filings. Elliot rode with him north. Thomas searched old documents. Clara kept coffee hot and watched men who had nearly surrendered begin learning what they actually owned. On the 6th evening, Elliot came through the kitchen door carrying a preliminary report. He didn't take it to Thomas first. He brought it to Clara. Read that. She did. Then again. The water rights attached to Silver Creek changed the ranch's value dramatically. The debt that had seemed crushing against Duke's whispered valuation looked very different against a current assessment. Clara lowered the paper. Duke knew. Elliot said nothing. He didn't have to. 10 years of low offers. 10 years of rumors. 10 years of Thomas being taught to believe Silver Creek was worth less every winter. Duke had never been waiting for a worthless ranch to fail. He had been waiting for a valuable rancher to stop believing his own land had value. Thomas read the report at Margaret's old kitchen table. There was no celebration. Only a tired man staring backward through 10 years of his life. He knew, Thomas whispered. Elliot sat opposite him. After a long while, Thomas said, I did something like that to you. Elliot looked up. I kept telling you this ranch would be yours. Never asked whether you wanted it. Never taught you why it mattered. Just laid it on your shoulders and called that love. Elliot's eyes lowered. I said things about Ma I wish I could take back. I know. I was angry. I know that too. 7 years remained between them. But for once, neither man tried to cross all 7 in a single conversation. Clara quietly left them alone. 3 days later, another letter arrived from Billings. The bank had suspended the accelerated deadline while the final assessment was reviewed. Suspended, not canceled. Silver Creek had not won yet. But outside, water had begun dripping from the barn eaves in the afternoon sun. Snow softened along the creek banks, and when Clara checked the cold frames, one thin green shoot had pushed through the soil. She touched it carefully. Spring was coming. So was the bank's decision. And if Silver Creek survived long enough for one to arrive, Clara knew Elliot's promised question would arrive with the other. The bank's letter came on a muddy Tuesday morning. Elliot carried it inside without opening it. Thomas was at the table with his spectacles low on his nose. Clara stood at the stove, one hand wrapped around a wooden spoon. Nobody spoke. Thomas finally nodded. Elliot broke the seal. His eyes moved down the page, then stopped. The original terms stand. Thomas removed his spectacles. Elliot read the sentence aloud. The bank had accepted the updated assessment. Silver Creek's spring payment schedule would remain unchanged. The Jarity cattle connection gave them a market. Daniel Marsh's word had restored confidence with men who had begun keeping their distance. And Harlan Duke's 6-week trap was finished. Thomas leaned back. Clara expected laughter. Instead, the old rancher covered his eyes with one hand. For several seconds, the only sound was coffee simmering near the stove. Then Thomas whispered, Margaret would have liked you. Clara looked away before he could see what that did to her. Another document arrived 2 days later. Harlan Duke was withdrawing his interest in Silver Creek. 10 years of pressure ended without a gunshot or a fistfight. Just ink on paper. Clara laid the notice beside Margaret's journal. It's over. Elliot looked toward the window. This part is. She smiled faintly. He had learned. Silver Creek was safe, but it was still a ranch. Cattle would get sick. Fences would break. Winter would return. There would always be another payment, another storm, another hard decision. The difference was that the Callahans finally knew what they possessed. Thomas began coming back to himself in ordinary pieces. First the barn, then the creek, then Margaret's apple trees. One morning, Clara heard him outside cursing a sagging gate that refused to hang straight. A moment later came a laugh. She stopped kneading bread. Months earlier, those same boots had beaten helplessly against a hallway baseboard while fever shook his body. Now they crossed his own yard again. Clara listened for another moment, then returned to the dough. Later that week, Thomas and Elliot walked beyond the north pasture. Snow remained beneath the pines, but the creek ran dark and strong between broken shelves of ice. Thomas rested both hands on the top rail. You don't owe me this place. Elliot turned. I mean it. If you want Denver, go. If you want something else, find it. Silver Creek doesn't have to become yours because I got old. 7 years earlier, those words might have saved them both considerable pain. Now Elliot understood why they had needed 7 years to be spoken honestly. He looked across the pasture, at the barn, at the creek, then toward the ranch house. Clara stood behind the kitchen window, shaking flour from a cloth. I'm not staying because it's mine, Elliot said. Thomas waited. I'm staying because I want it to be. Thomas nodded once. That was enough. Spring did not arrive dramatically in Montana. It came in mud, in dripping roofs, in water moving beneath thinning ice. Then Clara found buds along Margaret's apple trees. She went immediately to the cold frames. Green shoots stood beneath the glass. Clara stared at them. Oh no. Behind her, a familiar voice said, Oh yes. She closed her eyes. Elliot was standing several yards away. She pointed toward the mountains. There's snow up there. It's Montana. There'll probably be snow somewhere in June. Ground's still half frozen. Clara. She looked at him. He smiled. It's spring. That afternoon, Elliot came into the kitchen. Not to the doorway, not near it. Into the kitchen. The distinction made Clara's heart beat harder than she wanted it to. No crisis waited outside. Thomas was strong enough to work. The bank was satisfied. Silver Creek did not need Clara Whitmore to save it anymore. Elliot stopped across the table from her. Stay, Clara. Her fingers tightened around her mother's cookbook. Not because Father needs you, he said. Not because this ranch does. He stepped closer. Because I do. Clara said nothing. I love you. There was no audience. No desperate promise made during a blizzard. Only Elliot. Only Clara. And the quiet kitchen where nearly everything between them had begun. She looked around. Margaret's spices remained on the shelf. Her own apron hung beside the stove. Her mother's cookbook rested beneath her hand. Through the window stood the barn Elliot had come from the first day, wet with snow and suspicious of the stranger commanding his father's kitchen. She had spent years entering other people's homes to work. Somewhere along the way, she had stopped feeling like a visitor here. Yes. Elliot didn't move at first. That's all you're getting, she said softly. His smile appeared slowly. Then he reached across the table. Clara placed her hand in his. Thomas chose that exact moment to appear in the doorway. He saw their hands. Elliot sighed. Go away, Dad. Thomas laughed. Clara pointed toward the yard. The eastern cold frame needs adjusting. I nearly died this winter, and now you're better. Apparently recovery only earns a man more chores. You wanted your ranch back. Thomas glanced outside. I reckon I did. He pulled on his coat and left them alone. That evening, Clara opened her mother's cookbook. For years, she had treated its margins like sacred ground. That night, she dipped the pen herself. She did not add a recipe. She wrote one sentence. Sometimes saving a home and finding one are the same thing. Clara, Elliot was calling from outside. She closed the book, then walked through the hallway where Thomas had once lain dying. She passed through the same door she had forced open against the blizzard. Elliot waited beyond it. The mountains still held snow. The creek was running. Margaret's apple trees were budding. Silver Creek was not suddenly rich. There would be debts and bad winters, lost cattle, stubborn gates, arguments, work. But Silver Creek knew what it had now. So did Thomas, so did Elliot, and finally, so did Clara. She had arrived carrying calloused hands and her mother's cookbook, believing she had come to cook for a rancher. Instead, she had helped a sick man stand again, helped a son come home by choice, and reminded a frightened community that something did not become worthless merely because another man kept saying it was. Elliot reached for her hand. This time Clara did not hesitate. The first morning he had seen her, he had stood in the kitchen doorway wondering what right she had to be there. Now they walked together toward the creek as evening settled across Silver Creek Ranch. Clara had saved the ranch because she saw what was already there. The water, the history, the family, the home, and Elliot. Maybe that was what Clara had been searching for all along without knowing how to name it. And maybe, if you had stood where she stood that spring evening, you would have understood why her answer mattered so much. Imagine arriving somewhere with little more than the lessons of someone you loved, only to find a family coming apart, and a man who had forgotten how to believe in his own home. Would you have stayed when the winter grew harder? Would you have trusted love enough to remain when leaving would have been easier? Clara never saved Silver Creek by pretending fear wasn't there. She stayed long enough to see what fear had hidden. Thomas still had strength. Elliot still had a way home. And beneath years of doubt, the ranch still carried value worth fighting for. Perhaps that's what second chances really are. Not a chance to erase what happened, but a chance to choose differently when the road brings us back to the same place. Sometimes healing looks like a father finally releasing his son from an old obligation. Sometimes it looks like a woman realizing she belongs somewhere because she is loved there, not because she is needed. And sometimes love simply waits until spring. If Clara's journey stayed with you, tell me in the comments what you think you would have done in her place. And if you'd like to spend more evenings with stories of frontier love, hard-won hope, mystery, and healing, you're warmly invited to subscribe. There are more stories waiting just beyond the next ridge.